Do you speak? Don't you speak? Do you say? Don't you say? Do you tell? Don't you tell? Do you express? Don't you express? Do you explain? Don't you explain? Do you talk? Don't you talk? Do you chat? Don't you chat? Do you sing? Don't you sing? Do you dance? Don't you dance? Do you lie? Don't you lie? Do you praise? Don't you praise? Do you blame? Don't you blame? Do you call? Don't you call? Do you ask? Don't you ask? Do you teach? Don't you teach? Do you read? Don't you read? Do you scold? Don't you scold? Do you request? Don't you request? Do you convince? Don't you convince? Do you advise? Don't you advise? Why do you insult? Why don't you insult? Why do you question? Why don't you question? Why do you answer? Why don't you answer? Why do you think? Why don't you think? Why do you remember? Why don't you remember? Why do you remind? Why don't you remind? Why do you plan? Why don't you plan? Why do you dream? Why don't you dream? Why do you believe? Why don't you believe? Why do you guess? Why don't you guess? Why do you concentrate? Why don't you concentrate? Why do you understand? Why don't you understand? Why do you imagine? Why don't you imagine? Why do you forget? Why don't you forget? Why do you practice? Why don't you practice? Why do you neglect? Why don't you neglect? Why do you hope? Why don't you hope? Why do you love? Why don't you love? Why do you hate? Why don't you hate? Why do you like? Why don't you like? Where do you ignore? Where don't you ignore? Where do you disturb? Where don't you disturb? Where do you see? Where don't you see? Where do you look? Where don't you look? Where do you recognize? Where don't you recognize? Where do you watch? Where don't you watch? Where do you find? Where don't you find? Where do you observe? Where don't you observe? Where do you learn? Where don't you learn? Where do you weep? Where don't you weep? Where do you hear? Where don't you hear? Where do you listen? Where don't you listen? Where do you take? Where don't you take? Where do you give? Where don't you give? Where do you bring? Where don't you bring? Where do you do? Where don't you do? Where do you get? Where don't you get? Where do you keep? Where don't you keep? Where do you show? Where don't you show? Where do you send? Where don't you send? What do you buy? What don't you buy? What do you sell? What don't you sell? What do you cook? What don't you cook? What do you make? What don't you make? What do you prepare? What don't you prepare? What do you try? What don't you try? What do you work? What don't you work? What do you write? What don't you write? What do you promise? What don't you promise? What do you start? What don't you start? What do you begin? What don't you begin? What do you complete? What don't you complete? What do you finish? What don't you finish? What do you help? What don't you help? What do you shut? What don't you shut? What do you open? What don't you open? What do you close? What don't you close? What do you put? What don't you put? What do you arrange? What don't you arrange? What do you collect? What don't you collect? How do you fight? How don't you fight? How do you save? How don't you save? How do you search? How don't you search? How do you catch? How don't you catch? How do you punish? How don't you punish? How do you pull? How don't you pull? How do you come? How don't you come? How do you go? How don't you go? How do you leave? How don't you leave? How do you play? How don't you play? How do you push? How don't you push? How do you meet? How don't you meet? How do you use? How don't you use? How do you study? How don't you study? How do you change? How don't you change? How do you cheat? How don't you cheat? How do you lose? How don't you lose? How do you win? How don't you win? How do you achieve? How don't you achieve? How do you fall? How don't you fall?